Hi, everybody. It's July 19th, and I've been posting these videos, July 19th, 2026, and I've been posting these videos as a form of therapy to recover from the trauma of watching my little brother, Paul Cairns, 64 with Down syndrome, be locked away by the British Columbia New Democratic Party government, David Eby as leader, Nikki Sharma as Attorney General, and Sheila Malcolmson as the cabinet minister responsible for Paul's care. So I'm going to talk about the circumstances of Paul's confinement, and then I believe he was murdered by the guardian appointed by the government and his doctor. So I'm going to talk about that, my personal experience, and then I'm going to talk about why medical assistance in dying or euthanasia in Canada is murder, a genocide, and a Holocaust. So Paul was locked away when I discovered a secret and what I alleged to be a fraudulent and forged power of attorney the government created to give Paul the COVID-19 shot on February 6th of 2021. So I discovered it when I applied to be Paul's guardian. It was supposed to be done, it was supposed to be open and not a secret, but it was done in secret. Paul had 6 surviving siblings at the time, but they only notified my then 82-year-old Catholic nun sister 4,000 kilometers away in Ontario, who had moved out when Paul was born, never cared for him at all, and did not understand his speech or communication, so she could not convey his wishes to anyone. So when I discovered this, I went to the Burnaby RCMP police and I complained. I knew the document was a forgery because I taught Paul to print the one word that he could print or understand, and that was his first name, Paul. It took me about a year as a little girl to teach Paul to print his name, and I could see that the signature on this guardianship agreement that signed over all of his human rights to this nun in Ontario was a forgery. And she never moved to be closer to Paul, and she never moved him to be closer to her. I had 2 other sisters, and my mother had cared for Paul. We took turns on weekends and holidays, giving him a home life. He was in the group home called L'Arche, which is a sort of phony pseudo-Catholic group home that was started by what turned out to be one of the worst sex abusers in Canadian history, a man named Jean Vanier, who it turned out, after he died in 2019, turned out that he had used these group homes as a way, as a conduit to having access to the workers and sexually assaulting the workers. But anyways, all of this came out after I raised the issue of this fraudulent and forged power of attorney. So as soon as I make a complaint to the police, the constable that I spoke to said that she would go and get a search warrant for the real document, the original, to determine whether it was a forgery or not. She did not do that. What she did instead was she tipped off the group home that I had complained, and their lawyer terminated my visits permanently. She wrote me a letter saying I would never see my brother again. So evil. Like, the story throughout will show you the evil that human beings are capable of, and the goodness as well. So I got this letter on September 12th, 2022, saying I would never see Paul again, even though I had a written agreement with the government that I could see him twice a week, once at the group home, and he could visit me at my home. I had taken Paul to Newfoundland twice. I'd taken him to Seattle. We went to the Pacific National Exhibition every year. We went on outings every weekend. and I was his last surviving family member. My mother had passed away. My other sister had passed away, and the other sister that had cared for Paul had moved to Vancouver Island. So I was his last surviving visitor. So I did everything that I could think of legally. I was trained and I worked as a psychologist for the government of British Columbia with mentally handicapped adults in a big institution for mentally handicapped adults in New Westminster. And then I went, in part because I wanted to help disabled adults, I went to law school, and I became the first single parent to graduate from law school, British Columbia history. And for several years, I worked as a Canadian federal prosecutor, prosecuting drug crimes and federal offenses. And then I worked as a family lawyer for Carrie Lynn Finley, who's currently the leader of the Conservative Party of British Columbia. She taught me family law, and then I went out on my own. I practiced family law for about 23 years. Although I myself was disabled in an accident in 2008, and I wasn't able to work full time as a lawyer after that, and I couldn't support myself working part time as a lawyer. So I did everything that I could through the courts legally and civilly to try and restore Paul's visits. I just wasn't able to do it. Once the nun knew that I was alleging that the document she was relying on was a fraud and a forgery, the Catholic Church threw the weight of its billions of dollars against me. I estimate that the Catholic Church, although I'm a member of the Catholic Church, a contributing member of the Catholic Church, and I was baptized at birth, I estimate they spent $2 million, more than $2 million, on her legal representation to uphold this fraudulent and forged power of attorney. And as I said, she never moved to be closer to Paul or moved him to be closer to her. So I exhausted all of my attempts to try and restore Paul's visits. Basically, that's what I just wanted to ensure his freedom. I wanted to restore his freedom. On April 15th of 2024, 588 days after Paul had been locked away by the government, I got a phone call from the nun's Vancouver lawyer. So she had two law firms working for her pretty much around the clock. A lawyer named Charles Gibson in Ottawa, and the law firm Borden, Ladner, Gervais here in Vancouver. And her Vancouver lawyer was a young man named Casey Deanshaw. I got an email from him on April 15th of 2024 saying that Paul had had a stroke and that he was at Burnaby Hospital, but I could arrange a visit through him. He had promised the judge that appointed my sister, the nun, as Paul's guardian, that I would be able to visit Paul, but then he never allowed that to happen. So he's a shyster and a crook, and he's completely a corrupt lawyer. I never used Casey Deanshaw. What I found out is that the Burnaby RCMP had been ordered. I got a phone call from the Burnaby RCMP on April 21st while I was waiting to visit with Paul. The nun flew in when it was clear Paul was not going to die and he was recovering. She flew in and she put Paul in a room with herself. And I was only allowed a 10-minute per day visit with him. They were still afraid that I might try and get an authentic sample of Paul's signature. So I would sit in the hallway. While I was sitting in the hallway, I got a telephone call from the Burnaby RCMP from a staff sergeant saying they had been ordered by their Ottawa oversight agency to reopen the investigation into the fraudulent and forged power of attorney. And I was so excited. I thought, oh my God, this is a breakthrough. Paul's going to finally have his visits restored, his freedom restored. I was so excited. What I didn't know is that the Burnaby RCMP again had tipped off the nun that they had been ordered to reopen the investigation to the fraudulent and forged power of attorney a month earlier. So the nun knew that it's a little bit complicated, but it's important to understand. So she knew a month before this police officer telephoned me that they had reopened the investigation into the fraudulent and forged power of attorney. And so what her lawyers did is they mounted an application to have me designated permanently what's called a vexatious litigant, which is a very rare and unusual designation in Canadian law that strips me of all my access to Canadian courts, even though I had practiced law with no complaint for 23 years. So as soon as they were tipped off by the RCMP, they applied to have me designated a vexatious litigant so that I would be discredited as a witness in this RCMP investigation. So they knew that, the nun knew that, but I didn't know that. Then when I finally I got the phone call from the police, I was so excited. I went to court the next morning and asked the judge to suspend the nun's authority over Paul and pending the investigation by the RCMP. But we didn't get that. I didn't get that order that morning. And when I got back to the hospital, to Paul's room, I could see that when I walked in the room, the nun wouldn't look me in the eye, but she just said through her teeth, gritted teeth, "Say goodbye to Paul, he's dying." And what I could see is that Paul had all his medical supports were stripped away. So he was recovering, and he sat up, and they even had to tie his arm down. And he was responsive. He looked me in the eye. He squeezed my hand so hard when I said my name, I thought he was going to crush it. He grabbed a book from my hand and turned the pages perfectly. But he was wearing a ventilator, an oxygen mask, and he had other medical supports. But all of those had been stripped away, and he appeared to me to be dead, that they had killed him, that his eyes were wide open and his pupils were fixed and dilated. His skin was cool to the touch, and he was completely unresponsive. So I believe the nun and the doctor on that ward, whose name is Dr. Michael Baker, had done medical assistance in dying on Paul, that she had ordered that his medical supports be removed and that he be sedated to death. And I've said this practically every day since it happened. So they have never they've never said, no, we didn't do that. So I could see that Paul was dead, that she had killed him. They had committed murder right in front of my eyes. So I complained immediately to my contact at the Burnaby RCMP. I emailed him and I said, please treat Paul's death as suspicious, which they did not do. They never investigated it. They never interviewed. My sister thought if Paul was dead, there could be no investigation into the fraudulent forged power of attorney. And she was absolutely right, because I never heard from the Burnaby RCP again. They never contacted me. They never interviewed me. Although I had begged them I said, meet with me, but they never did. And they never, to my knowledge, ever investigated. Well, they did investigate Paul's death, but they never interviewed me about why I thought he had been killed. What was my evidence? So you can imagine how traumatic that was. And then after Paul died, and after they had stripped Paul of all of his civil rights and his human rights, they went after me to strip me of my access to Canadian courts, because I guess they were afraid that I was going to sue them for wrongful death. And they had a 4-day application before Justice Judith E. Hoffman. And I had explained to the judge during this application to strip me of my rights, to designate me permanently a vexatious litigant. I'd explained to her that I had a heart attack in 2016, and I have 2 medical certificates saying I can't appear in court for longer than 2 hours per day. And she said no, because, she didn't say anything at the time, but she just went on, and the hearing 2 full days. So after 2 hours, I got up and left. And at the end of 2 full days, she designated me permanently a vexatious litigant. So I can't even respond. If you sued me, I couldn't respond to defend myself. I can't file any document in the court without permission of the judge. So when this happened, I've been designated a vexatious litigant. So, anyone in the world basically has more access to Canadian courts. Like a Somalian refugee in Somalia has more access to Canadian courts than I do. I have none. And I've applied to have that set aside, and I was not successful. So after all of this happened, after they stripped Paul of all of his rights as a human being and me of all of my rights, even my access to the courts, I started researching this medical assistance in dying. The government of Canada calls it MAiD. You might have heard of this MAiD program. And I thought, I was a federal prosecutor for 3 years. And I thought, how on earth could murder go from being a capital offense where you would be hanged for doing it up to 1999, where if a medical doctor did exactly the same thing to a patient, if they administered a lethal injection with the purpose of killing them, they would be subject to the Criminal Code of Canada, and they could be hanged if they were in the Canadian Armed Forces. And what I discovered, and I'll try and explain this as best I can, but what I discovered that happened, and please try and understand this. So what I'm saying is the foundation of the authority of the Canadian government to kill what has now been, they've executed extrajudicially more than 103,000 innocent, vulnerable, 96% white Canadian citizens as medical care since 2015. Since February of 2015. So I thought, how the hell did that happen? How in my country, where I was a prosecutor, and it took me an incredible amount of work to put somebody in prison for a month, could a doctor kill a human being? And what I discovered is that the Supreme Court of Canada, which is the top court of Canada, corresponds with the Supreme Court of the United States, made a decision outlawing euthanasia or mercy killing about 20 years ago in a case called Rodriguez, Canada versus Sue Rodriguez, where a woman with multiple sclerosis had been put forth as the test case to have doctors kill patients, mercy kill patients, and she was not successful. And the Supreme Court of Canada, and this was after the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the Supreme Court of Canada said no, it was not in the public interest for doctors to kill their patients, and for obvious reasons. I mean, the Hippocratic Oath, the former Hippocratic Oath starts with first, do no harm, and it said you say I will administer no poison, where that's exactly what doctors do now. They kill patients, or they kill people, not patients, as people, exactly the same way that convicted murderers are executed by lethal injection in the United States. So what I discovered is that in a group, a non-governmental organization, a ghoulish death cult, which I believe was backed by all of this, I believe, my theory, and it's subject to investigation. My theory is that the Communist Party of China is behind all of this death cult in Canada of euthanasia. They wanted to get rid of Canadian citizens, and this is one way of doing it without having to drop bombs or fire a single bullet, is to implode the Canadian people from within, using their own institutions. So in February of 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada in Ottawa, led by the Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, who is a judge I know quite well. I've met her at a conference when I was going to law school, and she was actually a hero and an idol of mine because she was a widow, and but she led the Supreme Court of Canada panel of 9 unelected civil servants appointed by the government, but they're unelected. So you never voted for this change in law where the government kills its own citizens extrajudicially. So in February of 2015, this is the decision. It's called, read it. You can look it up easy as can be, Canada versus Carter. Canada and Carter. Kay Carter was a woman who was already dead at the time that the Supreme Court of Canada considered her application to be killed. So Kay Carter was put forward by Death with Dignity, this ghoulish, as I said, ghoulish death cult. And these people that want to kill other people, well, I'll tell you, there's nothing like the drive of someone that wants to kill other people. They like the power. It's like a high for them. It's the ultimate control. Look at Ted Bundy. Look at Wayne Gacy, all of the serial killers. Look at Hitler. In the end, when Hitler had a chance to maintain the Germans' authority over Europe or focused on its extermination plans, it focused on the extermination, killing of people. They like it. They like it. You might like chocolate chip cookies, but these Death with Dignity people, they like to kill people. So what I discovered is that Death with Dignity, it put forward this woman who was now dead. All she had was, she wasn't terminally ill. She had something called spinal stenosis, so a kind of fusion of her spine. And they said it wasn't fair for her. So anonymously, which most court judgments are written by a particular judge or set of judges, so you know who wrote it, and often other judges on the panel might dissent, so you get a majority that decide one way, and you might have dissenting decisions the other way. But no, in this decision, even though it was overturning a very solid precedent of Canada versus Rodriguez, saying that euthanasia was illegal and unlawful and that upheld the Criminal Code of Canada provisions against murder, in February of 2015, that is the moment they wrote this ridiculous, preposterous decision. And Beverly McLaughlin was the Chief Justice at the time, so you can blame her. And this is very important. So they said that Kay Carter had a constitutional charter right under Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which says everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except for in accordance with the fundamental principles of justice. So that's what it says. But this ridiculous, preposterous, bizarre decision of the Supreme Court of Canada, which I believe was fed them by the Communist Party of China, said that Kay Carter, this woman who had already gone to Switzerland and was long dead, had a right to be killed by the Canadian government. It's a constitutional charter right to be killed. And they gave the Canadian government 12 months to come up with a system of killing people in a way that addressed the inherent unlawfulness of murder and greed and all the other motives that people have for killing people, and provided a guide rails for killing people in a safe way. And what the Canadian government ended up doing was setting up this scheme where you don't need to be terminally ill, you don't need to be dying, you just need to have some kind of grievous complaint. You could be deaf or blind or have bowel disease or any consistent grief. Basically, anyone can ask to be killed by their doctor now. But they have to be, at this point, they have to be mentally competent. But as I said, my brother, I had a court order specifically stating that my brother was declared to be incapable. So he was never capable of consenting to being killed by the nun and her doctor, Michael Baker. He could not consent to have his medical supports removed. So since that time, Canada has killed, since that decision on February of 2015, Canada has killed by Canada Day 2026. And I've been making videos against this for 5 years now. But Canada has killed 103,000 Canadian citizens, more than 45 innocent, vulnerable people every single day. All it takes is the signature of any medical doctor or any nurse. They need 2 signatures on a piece of paper. It's not even a sworn affidavit. There's no judge. There's no jury. They have no right to legal advice. In the States, before they put to death a person, they have to be convicted of a capital offense like murder, and they get millions of dollars in legal supports and appeals, but nothing in Canada, not a dime. Not a dime is spent on their legal support. And the person that gets to decide if they're the judge, jury, and executioner is any doctor or any nurse, a pair of them. And there have been innumerable cases of people changing their mind and being held. In one case, a man changed his mind, and the doctor told his family to hold him down, and they killed him anyways. And most recently, last year, a woman named Miriam Lancaster went into the Vancouver General Emergency with a sore back, and they didn't even ask her a question. They just said, we've decided, a young female doctor came up and asked her or told her, we've decided to offer you MAiD. Can you imagine your doctor offering to kill you? It's so bizarre. And now a lot of people, I mean, there's people that, when you hear about euthanasia, you think, well, it's the government. They must have some good reason, or there must be some good policy. No. Hitler did exactly the same thing. In 1939, Hitler killed every single person, or started a process of gassing with carbon monoxide every single elderly, ill, and disabled person, a mentally ill person in Germany. And there's estimates that he killed, and there was actually an outcry in Germany, and he pretended to stop in 1941, but he didn't stop. In exactly the same way as what's happening in Canada now. The doctors and nurses would secretly kill everybody. Hitler called them useless mouths. Now, certainly, with the modern technology and all the systems we have in place, you think we could come up with a system of just killing people that are, really, really, really want to die and would never change their mind. But human nature being what it is, we can't do it. So my argument against euthanasia is, number one, nobody can give informed medical consent to being killed, because it's not a medical decision. It's a legal decision, and we don't know what death is. In my faith, in the Catholic faith, if you commit suicide, you burn in hell forever, and you have eternal damnation unless you repent before you die. But that's generally what happens. If you're not baptized, you go to purgatory. And if you've received all the sacraments and you've repented, you can go to heaven. And that's what I think. I expect to meet my loved ones in heaven at some point when I die. I believe in the Jewish faith there's no afterlife. That's why they say, may his memory forever be a blessing. In the Islamic faith, I think there is an afterlife. You go to heaven and you get to have sex with 72 virgins, or in some sects. But we don't know, so no one can give any physician informed consent to being killed, in the same way that you could give informed consent to back surgery or heart surgery. Secondly, so first, you can't give informed consent. It's impossible. Secondly, it's irreversible. So Canada outlawed capital punishment, hanging, which people were hanged right up until 1999. And my own grandfather had 2 of his clients were hanged. 2 of his clients before he became an Ontario Superior Court Justice, and he was devastated. a First Nations client, and an immigrant from Sweden. So we outlawed hanging for civilians in 1976 and for the military in 1999 because it's irreversible. There's many decisions that are made. People change their mind, but death is one thing that is irreversible. That's the thing about death. It's irreversible. And finally, there is that phony argument that the Supreme Court of Canada came up with, that they satisfied themselves that the Canadian government could come up with a system of guardrails so that the killing by the government of innocent, the most vulnerable people in Canada would not be abused by the government. Something that in 40,000 years of human civilization, it's never been done. You know, what strikes me is that we know that Neanderthals did not kill their elderly, ill and dying. Neanderthals. It's not some new medical treatment. It's not a medical treatment at all. We could always kill people, and quickly and painlessly too, but we didn't do it because it is profoundly undercuts all societal restraints. And there's no system on earth. So the Supreme Court of Canada, pretended to satisfy itself that the Canadian government could do something that hasn't been done in the history of civilization and goes against every security of human rights that is advance in human rights has taken place since the Magna Carta in 1215, over 800 years ago. But what I wanted to point out is that the Chief Justice of this Supreme Court of Canada panel that profoundly changed the law in Canada in a way that I can't even recognize in what I practiced for 23 years. She immediately, in 2018, went to work for the Communist Party of China in Hong Kong as a Court of Appeals judge, and she worked there for 6 years. Now, the Communist Party of China does not have, it is a capital offense, euthanasia. Doctors cannot kill patients in China, and they'd get a bullet to the back of the head if they did. But what the Communist Party of China does do on a wholesale basis is they execute their political prisoners, which are primarily people of the Falun Gong religion. They execute them and harvest their organs for the elite. And I believe that, and I'm saying it right now, that I put it to you, Beverly McLaughlin, to prove that you were not paid off by the Communist Party of China to undermine the whole social fabric of Canada and our 800 years of our common law, by making this ridiculous, reversing your earlier decision that mercy killing was a criminal offense. So one last point that I wanted to make is that this killing in Canada of 103,000 Canadian citizens is a genocide. And what we've found is that the people that are being killed are 96% of European descent, Canadian-born citizens. And I bet it's higher than that. I'm quite sure that there's not an Asian or an African on earth that would allow their loved one to be put down like a dog this way. And that it's a scheme, as I said, of the Communist Party of China to undercut our Canadian, and also with the support of people like Mark Carney, the World Economic Forum. I don't even know what to call him. But that's it. Please get the word out that it's, people don't understand what this involves. It undercuts killing our most vulnerable. You might think, like, you look at my situation, for example, because my brother was disabled, because he had Down syndrome, and I grew up caring for him, that caused me to become first a psychologist and then to care for people with mental handicaps as a psychologist, and then to go into law to protect them. So although it may look like they're useless mouths, that sick, ill, elderly, and disabled and dying people may look like useless mouths, that people very often, like the invention of Alexander Graham Bell, invented the telephone because his wife was deaf, and he was always trying to help deaf people. And almost all of the advances that come from science are because people are struggling to help their vulnerable loved ones. And you never know whose vulnerable loved one is, will result in the cure for insulin, the cure for diabetes. There often is a family connection where scientists and physicians will try and help their loved ones. And just caring for somebody who's vulnerable has a positive impact on society, and killing them has the opposite effect. So that's all I want to say for now. I love you all. Please get the word out. Share this video far and wide, and never say MAiD. They call it medical assistance in dying. That's their made up Soviet-style propaganda word that even people who oppose it use it. But it's not medical. Medical is from the Greek verb to heal, and you don't heal anyone by killing them. I love you all. Take care.